Chapter 3, Good Grief. As I say, those 3 years journeying toward death with Petey and his family changed my life. The pain of watching my friend die a horrible death and being impotent to do anything about it unleashed unanswerable questions into my well-ordered theological world. My suffering shattered the idol I had made out of my far too tiny concept of God. I thought I had God figured out. I had made a living out of teaching others what God likes, who God likes, and what to do to become someone God likes. All that began to unravel with Petey's dying. At the same time, those 3 years pulled a grace and sensitivity out of me I didn't know I had. I became a better human being by traveling with Petey on his road to death. While I could never have volunteered for the journey, I would not want to be the person I was before that experience. That's the paradox grief offers. Grief is ugly, messy, and merciless. It reaches up from our bowels and shatters the illusion that we are in control of our lives. It takes us, against our will, dangerously close to the frontier of insanity. Yet at the same time, it is the fertile soil where a whole new way of seeing and experiencing life can take root. Now, one of the premises of this book is that our suffering can sometimes be the doorway to a much richer way of living, a life with more compassion and wisdom. Of course, there's no guarantee that suffering will lead to greater wisdom and compassion, but it is a real possibility. Numerous faith traditions testify to this reality. For example, one of my heroes, Francis of Assisi, experienced drastic change in his life after a near-death experience and protracted recovery from illness. Francis was converted from a self-centered, materialistic pleasure seeker to an other-centered, spiritually minded saint. Ignatius of Loyola, who helped found the Jesuits, also had his spiritual awakening after a near-death experience. Zen Buddhist masters of the Rinzai school work with the help of koans, illogical questions, to bring their disciples to the point of mental collapse in the hopes of satori, an awakening, will take place. Ascetics around the world willingly go to the edges of their emotional, psychological, and physical limits in the hope of experiencing an awakening, salvation, self-actualization, enlightenment, call it what you will. Native Americans go to sweat lodges on vision quests. Sufis become whirling dervishes. It seems many of us want more from life than just working at tedious jobs in order to make money for things to buy that don't make us happy. Too many people spend their lives in such pursuits only to wake up 40 years later and face the uncomfortable questions, what is life all about? Why am I here? For most of us living in North America, the most common type of suffering we experience is grief. There are certainly other causes of suffering, some even more painful, but grief is one form of suffering common to us all. Grief can be a doorway to this changed life experience, this moment of light, or it can simply make us mean and bitter. I've met, worked with, and prayed for so many people who've been sabotaged by the insidious feelings of, why me? This isn't fair, and I don't deserve this. These sentiments, while common and even necessary in the short term, are often destructive over the long haul. If we remain stuck in such places, we may find that our spirits shrivel and our souls atrophy until we become self-centered caricatures of living beings. Sadly, well-meaning but insensitive religious people too often magnify the pain of this living death with tactless comments or seemingly pious platitudes. So what's the difference? What causes the experience of grief to be a source of enlightenment leading to a more fulfilled life for some people, while for others It is simply a knife piercing the soul and leaving behind a breathing corpse of an existence. Although some spiritual guides assert with certainty that our attitude is what makes the difference, I'm not so sure. I agree that the individual's attitude is important, particularly in regard to choices like forgiveness and surrender, and we'll talk more about those later. But I've also seen where the demand that folks should buck up in a time of grief can lead to feelings of shame and guilt when they are unable to put on a happy face. Often, out of our own discomfort with uncontrolled, raw emotional pain, we commit spiritual abortion by trying to fix others and make them feel better before they're ready to be reborn into a new life. Trying to hurry ourselves or others through the grieving process is much like the story of the butterfly in Zorba the Greek. "One morning," says Zorba, "I discovered a cocoon in the bark of a tree, just as the butterfly was making a hole in its case and preparing to come out. I waited for a while, but it was too long in appearing, and I was impatient. I bent over and breathed on it to warm it. I warmed it as quickly as I could, and the miracle began to happen before my eyes, faster than life. The case opened, the butterfly started slowly crawling out, and I shall never forget my horror when I saw how its wings were folded back and crumpled. The wretched butterfly tried with all of its whole trembling body to unfold them. Bending over, I tried to help it with my breath. In vain. It needed to be hatched out patiently, and the unfolding of the wings should be a gradual process in the sun. Now it was too late. My breath forced the butterfly to appear all crumpled before its time. It struggled desperately and a few seconds later died in the palm of my hand. That little body is, I do believe, the greatest weight I have on my conscience. For I realize today that it is a mortal sin to violate the great laws of nature. We should not hurry, we should not be impatient, but we should confidently obey the eternal rhythm. The fact is, grief must have its way, and it is different for every person. Often it takes its own sweet time. The process cannot be rushed. We human beings are very complex. We react differently in similar situations. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to the problem and opportunity of grief. Grief is hell. It's not often when I'm called back to the hospital after the end of my workday, but when I am, it's never good. The charge nurse on the other end of the phone was frantic. A baby had just died in the emergency room, and I needed to be there now. The automatic doors of the emergency department opened before me with the characteristic swoosh, and I walked into hell. The beautiful young mother, Olivia, stood in a corner, tenderly holding her dead child wrapped in a swaddling blanket. As Olivia sobbed gently, her husband, Francisco, was writhing on the bed in the trauma bay, howling with grief. Francisco's mother, the baby's grandmother, was in another bay of the ER being monitored for high blood pressure. She was the one who had found the baby dead in his crib at home. The rest of the ER was in chaos. After getting bits of the story from staff and other family members who were there, I went into the trauma bay to provide support for the shocked parents. Francisco and Olivia had been out Christmas shopping, while Grandma was babysitting 6-month-old Eduardo at home. He'd been sleeping quietly in his crib when Grandma, just checking on him, found he was not breathing. He was gone before getting to the hospital. Walking into that trauma bay, I could feel the energy being sucked out of my own body. Such deep, raw grief is like an emotional black hole swallowing everything in its vicinity. Words are useless. I simply hugged the two young parents, looked sympathetically at the lifeless child in Olivia's arms, and then quietly introduced myself. No one said anything for a long time. After a while, I encouraged Olivia to lay Eduardo on the gurney so I could escort her and Francisco to the quiet room. There were several reasons for this. One was to reconnect them to their assembled family so they could receive loving support. Another was to help them get some fresh air to breathe as they gradually absorbed the reality of their situation. And sadly, I also needed to clear the trauma bay, since it would be considered a crime scene until the county coroner could arrive and determine the baby's cause of death. This is standard protocol for every hospital, and it is incredibly painful. The next 4 hours seemed to go on in slow motion, giving these beautiful young parents space to grieve with their family, checking in on Grandma, who was blaming herself for not looking in on Eduardo earlier, providing tissues and coffee and food as needed, standing by to serve while not trying to be intrusive, and caring for members of the hospital staff who were also deeply grieving. Eduardo had been born at our hospital, and the OB folks on duty remembered him and his family. The primary nurse caring for the family had several small young children at home, so she emotionally identified with the whole situation. When Olivia's doctor and OB/GYN arrived, she hugged the parents deeply, and there uttered from them all such a wail of lament that it felt like all of the air in the ED was vacuumed out of the place. We learned that in his short 6 months, Eduardo had experienced several heart problems and had been to see several specialists. I was relieved when the coroner determined the child's death was simply a tragedy. The specter of suspicion was dissipated. Being in the presence of such raw grief is exhausting. When I got home, it took a long time to get to sleep. Images of Olivia and Francisco and Grandma, faces twisted by awful emotional pain and shock, did not want to go gently into that good night. But I am glad I was there. I'm glad someone was present whose sole job was to care for these young parents, to offer them space to grieve the death of their beloved son, to give them respect and dignity and the awful waiting for the examination to conclude, to pray that they would experience grace, even in hell. The Aquarium. A piece in the June 13 and 20, 2011 issue of New Yorker magazine called The Aquarium by Bosnian-born Alexander Heman offered an eloquently frightening window into this raw despair of grief. Heman's second daughter, 1-year-old Isabel, died after a grueling fight with a cancerous brain tumor. Isabel's grieving father writes, "One of the most despicable religious fallacies is that suffering is ennobling, that it is a step on the right path to some kind of enlightenment or salvation. Isabel's suffering and death did nothing for her or us or the world. We learned no lessons worth learning. We acquired no experience that could benefit anyone, and Isabel most certainly did not earn ascension to a better place, as there was no better place for her than at home with her family. Without Isabel, Terry and I were left with oceans of love we could no longer dispense. We found ourselves with an excess of time that we used to devote to her. We had to live in a void that could be filled only by Isabel. Her incredible absence is now an organ in our bodies whose sole function is a continuous secretion of sorrow." Earlier in the article, Heman shared, "We stayed away from anyone who we feared might offer us the solace of that supreme platitude, God. The hospital chaplain was prohibited from coming anywhere near us." As a chaplain, I fully understand his sentiment. There are times when no words of comfort are acceptable. As I share his story with you, I try to imagine what I would have done if Heman would have let me sit with him. I hope I would have kept my mouth shut in the presence of such deep pain, put my arm around his shoulder, cried, and screamed at God with him. I don't know if Heman will ever experience enlightenment or salvation, or if his pain from helplessly watching his daughter's suffering will ever cease. I hope so. But in no way do I want him to feel inferior or like a spiritual mutant if it doesn't. The truth is, there is no magic spiritual formula or amount of self-determination that can guarantee enlightenment. None of us can make an awakening happen without help from an unknown source. It is only by the ineffable, awful grace of God that our pain, grief, and suffering can miraculously become fonts of wisdom and compassion.